On July 14, 1944, at 30,000 feet above Budapest, the nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress simply vanished. First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson of the 483rd Bomb Group sat in the left-hand seat of B-17G Mizpah, watching black flak bursts rise through the contrails toward his formation. It was the 15th Air Force's latest strike against Hungary's rail and industrial network, a deep penetration mission from the group's dusty base in the Foggia complex of southern Italy. The target ahead was ringed with 88mm guns, and the gunners were fully awake. Around Swanson, his crew worked in the familiar choreography of a heavy bomber run. The navigator bent over his chart table in the nose section, the bombardier peered into his northern sight, and the co-pilot managed throttles and trim as the Fortress droned on at nearly 200 miles an hour. Farther aft, radio, waist, and tail gunners scanned the sky for fighters. The interphone carried terse course corrections and altitude checks, all of it wrapped in the steady vibration of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. For the men of the 15th Air Force, this was the dangerous middle stretch of the war. The Luftwaffe in the Balkans was wounded but not harmless. German and Hungarian flak batteries around Budapest, Vienna, and Ploiești had carved brutal gaps in many a bomb group's formation. Bomber crews joked grimly that if flak didn't get you, your 20th mission would. Swanson had no more than a second's warning, just the instinctive sense every bomber pilot developed when the pattern of bursts around his aircraft tightened from random to personal. An 88 shell detonated slightly low and forward on Mizpah's starboard side. The explosion did not merely punch holes. It erased the front of the airplane. In an instant, the plexiglass nose, the bombardiers and navigators' stations, the instrument panel, the control columns, everything forward of the pilot's feet, was blown away in a white-orange flash. The slipstream howled into the void. Paper, insulation, shards of aluminum, and pieces of equipment spun back through the fuselage like shrapnel. The shock stunned the crew, some were killed outright. Where Swanson's cockpit had been a moment before, there was now open sky and a ragged semicircle of torn metal. He found himself lashed to a fragment of floor, his harness the only thing keeping him from being hurled into the void. The control yoke in his hands had disappeared along with the rest of the instrument panel. The wind tore at his oxygen mask and flight jacket. There was nothing in front of him but cloud and the distant ground. Every engineering manual said this should not be survivable. The B-17's nose was not a cosmetic feature, it housed critical structure and the forward anchor points of the control system. Standard training assumed that if the cockpit was destroyed, the aircraft would tumble uncontrollably. Ground crews and Boeing engineers alike referred to such damage as a death sentence. Mizpah did not instantly disintegrate. She staggered. The Fortress dropped out of formation, nose pitching down, one engine windmilling uselessly. The aircraft began to roll and yaw, hunting for some new, fatal equilibrium. Swanson fought to orient himself, gripping whatever structure remained, instinctively testing what control he had left. Behind him, in the relative shelter of the radio room and waist, surviving crewmen struggled to understand what had happened. The interphone crackled with half-heard fragments, then mostly wind. Somewhere in that chaos, someone noticed that the long runs of steel cables leading aft from the missing control columns were still there, exposed now, whipping slightly in the gale, but intact where they passed through the fuselage. Those cables, ordinarily hidden behind panels and under floors, connected directly to the B-17's elevators, rudder, and ailerons. Flying schools had never covered what to do if the entire cockpit vanished and only bare cables remained. Yet in that instant over Budapest, the surviving crew faced a simple, terrifying question. Could human hands, braced in the bomb bay and radio room, do the work of the vanished control columns 30 feet forward? 3 engines still turned. The wing still generated lift. For the moment, gravity and drag were the only forces truly in command. With the altimeter unwinding and the city's flak zones and fighter fields below, 8 men had perhaps 10 minutes to find out whether a flying fortress could be flown not from its cockpit, but from its torn open spine. The first seconds after the blast were nothing but noise and blindness. Wind shrieked through the front of the aircraft, turning loose maps and log sheets into razors. The oxygen line feeding Swanson's mask ripped free, ice-cold air slammed his lungs. Beside him, where the co-pilot had been, there was only shredded harness webbing and open sky. Forward of the pilot's rudder pedals, the floor ended in a jagged curve of aluminum. The navigator's table and the bombardier's station were gone. A B-17G normally carried 10 men. In Mizpah, some of those 10 were now simply not there. Farther back, in the relative shadow of the wing box, the top turret gunner and flight engineer had been hurled against the side of the fuselage. The blast blew out interphone jacks and snapped headsets from ears. The radio operator, staggered by the concussion, groped for his chair and found only twisted metal. A waist gunner yelled something that no one heard over the slipstream roaring through the gutted nose. The fortress began to fall. Without the mass and rigidity of its cockpit, with the drag of the torn metal lip at the front, Mizpah pitched down sharply. One outboard engine coughed and ran rough, another shuddered as fragments of shrapnel tore through its cowling. The airplane rolled left, then right, hunting for an attitude it could no longer naturally find. Swanson, pinned by his harness, had almost nothing to work with. The rudder pedals were still under his boots, but the control yoke, his primary interface with 30 tons of aircraft, had simply ceased to exist. Where the column had entered the floor, only bare stubs of tubing and frayed cable ends remained. He tried the pedals. The tail responded sluggishly, some of the rudder linkage was still intact. But without elevator or aileron control, he could not bring the nose up or steady the wings. The fortress was on the edge of a diving spiral. It was the engineer who first truly understood what the exposed cables meant. Dragged to his knees, ears still ringing, he saw the long runs of steel wires whipping where they passed along the fuselage roof toward the tail. Normally they were hidden under panels and padding. Now, ripped free, they hung like the sinews of some wounded animal. One bundle led aft to the elevators, another to the rudder, others out to the ailerons and the wings. "There's still cable," he shouted, though no one could hear the words clearly. He grabbed a set in both hands and pulled. The B-17 twitched. In the bomb bay, with its narrow catwalk and cavernous open wells where bombs had hung minutes before, another crewman felt the movement and followed the engineer's gaze. It took only seconds for the idea, half instinct, half miracle, to leap between them. If the cables still ran unbroken to the control surfaces, then somewhere back here, human hands might stand in for the missing control columns. They had no training for this. No manual mention. But they did have the memory of how the airplane felt when Swanson eased back on the yoke or banked into a turn. They knew, in the literal sense, what control forces felt like. The radio operator managed to restore a shout-only version of the interphone by jamming torn wires together, creating a crude open circuit. It crackled and hissed, but it was enough for fragments of Swanson's voice to reach the men behind him. "Can you feel it? I've got nothing up here. Cables, grab the cables. I'll call what I need." In the bomb bay, two men wedged themselves on either side of the catwalk, bracing their feet against structure, bare hands gripping the elevator cables. Another took the rudder line farther aft. The aileron cables were harder, they branched toward the wings, but there were sections within reach where they could be gripped and hauled unevenly to imitate roll. Swanson forced his mind past the shock and the sight of open sky where his instrument panel had been. He thought instead in terms of inputs and responses. "Elevator, pull, both of you. Easy, easy." They hauled back on the twin cables, straining. The fortress shuddered, nose inching upward. Airflow over the tail bit, and the descent rate slackened. One engine still trailed smoke, but the airplane was no longer plunging nose first. Rudder, left. Just a touch. The man on the rudder cable dug in his heels and leaned back. The B-17's tail swung, bringing the nose around, wobbling but obedient. Somewhere not far below, Budapest's flak belts and fighter fields waited. Swanson needed altitude, distance, and any heading that pointed away from the blackened sky ahead and toward the hazy promise of the Adriatic. In 10-second bursts of shouted commands, they began to learn how to fly an amputated bomber. The elevator cables required two men and all their weight to make fine adjustments. The aileron lines, pulled unevenly, produced lurching rolls until they found a rhythm. Turbulence translated directly into spasms of force in their hands. The temperature at altitude numbed fingers and burned exposed skin, but they dared not let go even for a moment. 3 engines still delivered power. The wing still lifted. For the first time since the blast, Mizpah stabilized at something like level flight, dropping out of formation but no longer spinning toward oblivion. What none of them yet knew was whether this desperate, improvised control system could keep working long enough to carry them out of Hungary's lethal flak box, and whether the wounded fortress, with its nose torn away and its crew scattered along the fuselage, would hold together under the stress of the turn south toward home. What happened next turned Mizpah from a doomed airframe into a flying laboratory for survival. Once the first wild plunge was arrested, Swanson had seconds to turn desperation into a method. The fortress was still bleeding altitude, dropping out of the bomber stream in a long, shallow sag, but it was no longer tumbling. 3 engines pulled unevenly, the 4th, wounded, windmilled and chipped the wing. Through the ragged opening where the cockpit had been, Swanson saw the formation pulling away ahead, perfectly squared boxes of silver aircraft receding into the flak-scarred sky. Below, Budapest lay under a dirty quilt of smoke. Black bursts still reached up lazily, searching for targets now moving beyond their primary pattern. He could not stay there. On the jury-rigged interphone, his voice came in bursts, ragged with cold and lack of oxygen. "We're getting out of here. Nose up, slow. I need a shallow turn, southwest. Watch for fighters." In the bomb bay, the men on the elevator cables leaned back once more. Their shoulders and fingers burned from the strain. Every bump of turbulence telegraphed straight into tendons and joints. Another crewman crouched beside them, calling out the aircraft's pitch as he watched the horizon swing through a jagged gap in the fuselage skin. The B-17 responded, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably alive. They eased into a banking turn, the makeshift aileron men pulling alternately on the appropriate cable run, trying to translate shouted instructions into muscle memory. Too much pull rolled the fortress sharply, too little and the bank skidded, dragging the tail. Somewhere in that crude feedback loop, they found a narrow band where the aircraft answered without lurching. The problem of altitude pressed in on every breath. Normal operations kept heavy bombers above 25,000 feet, where the cold could flash freeze exposed skin and unprotected lungs. Now, with much of the nose structure gone, the slipstream knifed through the forward fuselage, turning the front third of Mizpah into a wind tunnel. Several oxygen lines had been severed. Any man not hooked to a working bottle felt the slow, nauseating creep of hypoxia. Swanson, half blinded by the freezing gale, knew they had to get down to thicker air or pass out at their improvised controls. Yet diving meant loading more stress onto a structure already missing much of its front end. The surviving Bombay crew, precariously braced, would have to ride that change in forces through their bare hands. "Take us down," he ordered. "No steep stuff. Just let her sink, slow." This time, the men on the elevator cables relaxed their pull by fractions. The nose dropped a few degrees. Wind noise climbed. The altimeter, what remained of it on a side panel aft of the destroyed cockpit, began to unwind faster. At 10,000 feet they could, in theory, ditch the frozen masks and breathe unassisted. Between 30,000 and 10, a lot could happen. Enemy fighters were the most obvious threat. A crippled fortress trailing behind the stream was a classic target. Waist gunners scanned the sky through frosted windows, fingers on triggers, eyes stinging from the rushing cold. Yet in that slice of time over Hungary, luck cut in their favor. German fighters were preoccupied with the intact formations and with their own fuel limits. Mizpah, bleeding altitude and escorted only by the occasional stray bomber dropping behind, slid out of the main engagement envelope. Inside, a different battle raged, against fatigue and the airplane itself. Control columns multiply a pilot's strength, cables do not. Every slight correction that would normally be made with an easy twist of the wrists now required a man, sometimes two, putting his weight into the steel lines. Muscles began to spasm. Hands that had started bare now hid inside improvised wraps of cloth torn from flight jackets to stave off the bite of metal at sub-zero temperatures. The fortress's behavior changed as they descended. Air grew thicker, control responses sharpened. Small cable pulls now produced bigger attitude shifts. The crew had to relearn the feel every few thousand feet, adjusting their effort against increasing aerodynamic force. Over-control became as dangerous as under-control. A hard heave on the elevator cables could overstress the weakened forward fuselage, too gentle a pull and the nose would drop again into a dive. Somewhere between flak bursts and cloud layers, the reality of their situation sank in. They had tamed the initial fall, turned away from Budapest, and were sliding southwest with 3 engines and an improvised control system. But home, Foggia, hundreds of miles away across mountains and enemy-held terrain, remained an almost absurd ambition. Even intact B-17s sometimes failed to limp back from deep 15th Air Force missions. Mizpah had no nose, no navigation instruments, no functioning bomb sight, and no way to land conventionally. The stress of long flight with such damage might tear her apart. And if they did somehow reach the Adriatic coast, what then? No pilot could flare and touch down from a seat open to the slipstream, relying solely on shouted cues from men 30 feet behind. As they dropped through 15,000 feet, the question that none of them had yet dared to voice grew impossible to ignore. Were they flying this gutted fortress in the hope of reaching a runway, or simply to buy enough time and control to choose where and when to leave her? In the narrow, vibrating tunnel of aluminum and wind where Mizpah still held together, 8 surviving men began to weigh a final choice: keep gambling on an airplane that had already defied engineering logic, or use their fragile grip on the cables to guide her to a place where parachutes, not wheels, would decide whether they lived or died. As the altimeter needle unwound past 12,000 feet, time stopped being an abstraction and became a shrinking column of air. By then, Mizpah had been flying on bare cables for several minutes. The rough circle of sky where the cockpit had been showed a different view now, not the black puffs of Budapest's flak, but scattered clouds and the softer greens and browns of countryside sliding beneath. They had edged clear of the tightest gun belts and the worst of the city's defenses. That bought them something more precious than distance: choice. No one in the crew pretended they could nurse a noseless fortress back to Foggia. The structure creaked and flexed with every small correction. Sheet metal around the gaping front shivered and tore. The strain of descent and the asymmetry of 3 working engines gnawed at spars and joints designed to share loads very differently. The longer they stayed aboard, the greater the chance that the bomber would simply fold in on itself. The question, unspoken but present in every breath, was no longer if they would leave the aircraft, but when, and whether they could keep enough control to make that exit survivable. At around 10,000 feet, those in the forward fuselage could finally tear off their frozen oxygen masks and suck thin but breathable air. Hypoxia's fuzz receded from the edges of their vision. With clearer heads, the grim arithmetic sharpened. Below, rural Hungary stretched in parcels of fields, villages, and woods. German-held territory, yes, but at least not a city center bristling with guns. The men on the cables had reached their limit. Hands were raw and bleeding where the steel had bitten through improvised cloth. Their forearms shook constantly now, muscles firing even when they tried to relax. One of them could barely close his fingers but still clung to the elevator lines because he knew that if he let go suddenly, the tail would sag and the nose would drop. In that state, no one could simply walk to a hatch and jump. The fortress needed conscious, coordinated control every second to remain stable enough for men to move inside it. So they devised a crude sequence. First, they experimented with trimming. Swanson, peering sideways at what few secondary controls remained in reach, called back for small, deliberate changes in cable tension while he adjusted the remaining trim tabs and engine power. They sought a combination where the aircraft would hold something close to level flight without constant heaving on the cables, an unstable equilibrium, but one with slower drift. Once they found that narrow pocket, the first man not essential to the improvised control team prepared to go. A waist gunner slung on his parachute, checked his harness with shaking hands, and crawled to the main hatch. 2 others stayed braced on the cables, ready to correct for any sudden lurch. He looked once down the fuselage toward the torn open front, then stepped into the screaming wind. The bomber bucked as weight shifted, but the men on the lines yanked and eased in counter-rhythm, keeping the nose from dropping too far. A few agonizing seconds later, someone at a side window shouted that they saw a shoot blossom below, one white, against the patchwork fields. Gradually, in ones and twos, the crew repeated the process. Each man left only when another had taken his place on a cable or proven that the airplane held its attitude with reduced hands. The radio operator, having done what he could to keep voices connected, was among the next to go. The top turret gunner followed, pausing only long enough to strip off his gloves and flex fingers that barely obeyed. At last, only a core remained, the elevator men in the bomb bay, the crewmen on the rudder line, and Swanson himself lashed to the fragment of floor at the front. For them, the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. A misjudged correction now could send the fortress into a tumble with comrades still inside. Swanson made his own decision in the cold calculus of a combat pilot. He could not land this aircraft. No runway would survive the impact of a 30-ton bomber without a nose trying to flare on improvised cable pulls. His duty was no longer to save the machine, it was to bring his crew as close as possible to conditions where their parachutes could do the rest. He ordered the last men on the cables to work the nose up slightly, bleeding off airspeed while keeping the wings level. When the fortress hit a speed and attitude that felt as gentle as the damage would allow, one of the bomb bay men tied off the elevator cables in place, crude loops around a structural beam, and then, with a last look at the vibrating metal around him, stepped into the empty space below. The final cable man did the same. For a few heartbeats, Swanson was alone in a cockpit that did not exist, guiding an aircraft by habit and instinct, trusting that the makeshift lashings aft would hold long enough. Then he unbuckled the harness that had kept him from being sucked out with the shattered nose, crawled backward along the twisted remains of the flight deck, and made his way to a hatch that still opened onto air and possibility. Somewhere over Hungarian farmland, a nearly headless B-17G continued on alone for a few more moments, held together by momentum and the last trim adjustments of hands that were no longer aboard. Behind it, 8 white parachutes drifted down, each one a tiny, fragile denial of the engineering verdict that had declared such damage unsurvivable. On the ground below, villagers and German troops looked up at the strange sight, a flying fortress with no face, lumbering on without a crew. The story of what happened after those chutes touched down, of capture, interrogation, and incredulous engineers tracing the scarred control cables, would spread almost as fast as the photographs that proved Mizpah had done what no one at Boeing had designed her to do. For the men under those white canopies, the war shrank to the size of a harness buckle and the ground rushing up at them. One by one, the surviving crew of Mizpah drifted down into rural Hungary. The roaring wind of the shattered fortress gave way to an eerie quiet broken only by the slap of parachute lines and the distant rumble of engines far above. Below, the neat patterns of fields and roads grew rapidly into individual trees, hayricks, and farmhouses. Training had taught them how to land, how to collapse a chute, how to run if they were lucky enough to touch down unseen. But parachuting into enemy country after bailing out of a noseless bomber was something no manual had contemplated. Most of them did not make it far. Farmers and local militia, alerted by the falling aircraft and the strange sight of a headless bomber limping overhead, converged on the landing zones. German troops, some from flak batteries, others from nearby garrisons, joined the chase. Within an hour, the 8 men who had left Mizpah alive were prisoners, herded at rifle point to a makeshift holding area in a village schoolyard. There, dazed and bruised, they watched as the remains of their aircraft completed its last, lonely act. Mizpah came down several kilometers away, gouging a furrow into a field. The nose section, what little was left of it, crumpled, but the wings and tail remained largely intact. To villagers who had seen hundreds of B-17s pass overhead in tight formations, this wreck was a shock. The front fuselage ended in a twisted ring of metal exactly where witnesses remembered seeing open air when the bomber had still been aloft. News of the capture and the wreck filtered quickly up German channels. Within days, the crew found themselves in the hands of Luftwaffe intelligence officers more curious than hostile. Standard interrogation focused on unit, base, and mission, but in this case the questioning soon turned to a single obsessive topic: how had their aircraft stayed in the air at all? At first, some interrogators simply did not believe them. The idea that a B-17 had flown 10 minutes or more without a cockpit sounded like a prisoner's desperate embellishment. But field reports from anti-aircraft units, combined with aerial observation and the testimony of civilians who had seen Mizpah pass overhead, forced a reconsideration. The wreck itself provided the final proof. Technical officers and engineers clambered through the torn fuselage. They traced the runs of the control cables, noting where blast damage had stripped away fairings and panels but left the steel wires intact. Scuff marks and blood on certain spans told their own story of hands that had clung there. In some sections, cables were still looped crudely around framing members, knots that had no place in Boeing's blueprints. Reports compiled by German investigators, later captured by the Allies, remarked with a mixture of professional respect and incredulity on what the Americans had attempted. One noted that control of elevators and rudder by direct manual pulling of the Bowden cables appears to have been used with some success, though he judged such a method extremely fatiguing and impractical for long duration. Back in Italy, the 483rd Bomb Group initially listed Swanson's crew as missing in action. When word filtered through the prisoner-of-war grapevine and through neutral channels that 8 men from Mizpah had survived bailing out over Hungary, the group's operations staff dug back into mission reports. Debriefings from other crews in the formation mentioned a fortress with its nose blown off still flying in rough control. Intelligence officers at 15th Air Force Headquarters realized they possessed a case study in structural and control survivability unlike any they had yet seen. After the war, when liberated POWs returned and filled in their own version of events, those fragments were woven together into one of the most extraordinary chapters in the B-17's combat record. Swanson and his surviving crewmen described in painstaking detail how they had gripped cables in the bomb bay, how much force it took to raise the nose, how the aircraft's behavior changed with altitude and speed, how they had tied off the lines before jumping. Boeing engineers, granted access to these accounts and to whatever photographs and sketches existed of the wreck, were struck by the implications. The Flying Fortress had been designed with redundancy and battle damage in mind: self-sealing tanks, multiple spars, distributed control runs. But no one in the design offices of Seattle had ever seriously contemplated a scenario where the entire nose and cockpit were removed and the machine still flew. Mizpah proved that in at least one case, the airframe could remain controllable if, and only if, a crew was willing to turn its own muscle and coordination into a living, breathing substitute for destroyed hardware. In the training syllabi and safety lectures that followed, both in the late stages of the war and in post-war flight schools, the incident became a legend with a practical edge. Instructors cited it as an extreme example of what could be achieved when aircrew understood their machines intimately and refused to surrender initiative to the apparent verdict of structural damage. The lesson was not that every crippled bomber could be saved. It was that as long as wings still generated lift and some part of a control system remained intact, there might be ways to fight physics with ingenuity long enough to survive. In the years after the war, when the noise of engines had faded and the Mediterranean bomber fields had gone back to dust and wheat, Mizpah refused to disappear. Within the 15th Air Force's records, the incident was flagged and copied, passed between engineering sections and safety officers. Reports that might otherwise have been routine, mission narratives, loss summaries, interrogation notes, were gathered into a small but unusual dossier. The case of a B-17G that had flown 10 minutes or more with its entire nose blown away, guided not by control columns but by the hands of its crew. Ewald Swanson and several of his men survived captivity and came home. When they finally sat in quiet offices stateside, facing interviewers instead of interrogators, their recollections were taken down carefully. These were not the excited, half-coherent stories of men fresh from combat. They were methodical, almost clinical accounts framed by pilots and crewmen who had had years to replay those 10 minutes over Budapest in their minds. They described the exact sequence of the blast, where the flak shell hit, how the pressure wave tore off the nose, what disappeared in that instant. They sketched the path of the control cables as they had seen them, whipping and bare along the fuselage. They demonstrated, sometimes with lengths of rope, how they had braced themselves in the bomb bay, how many men it took to move the elevators through a given arc, how quickly their strength had begun to fail. Engineers listened with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. By running the numbers, control surface areas, cable mechanical advantage, aerodynamic loads at given speeds, they concluded that such manual operation was just within the realm of the physically possible, at least for short periods and with reduced airspeed. Mizpah had flown at the outer edge of those calculations, in a narrow band where design margin and human endurance briefly overlapped. In post-war lectures on flight safety and aircraft survivability, the story assumed a different role. Instructors no longer had fleets of B-17s, but they did have pilots responsible for complex machines in which redundancy could sometimes be the difference between a crash and a forced landing. Mizpah became an example not of what designers intended, but of the unknown resilience built into systems simply by virtue of their complexity. The lesson for aircrew was blunt: as long as some part of the airplane still responded, it was worth fighting for control. Modern flight crew resource management, the doctrine that emphasizes communication, shared situational awareness, and using every brain and pair of hands on an aircraft, found in Mizpah an early, if extreme, case study. Swanson's crew had not survived because of one man's heroism at the controls. There were no controls. They survived because 8 men, separated by 30 feet of battered aluminum, turned themselves into an improvised, distributed control system. Later aviation survival courses, both military and civilian, would cite the incident alongside other improbable saves: jets landed after losing hydraulics, transports kept aloft with jammed elevators, combat aircraft brought home with half a wing missing. All these stories carried the same subtext, that checklists and procedures, while vital, could never fully anticipate the combinations of damage and circumstance that real life produced. In that catalog, Mizpah occupied a special niche. It was not only about mechanical bravery, it was about crew coordination under conditions where every normal channel, intercom, instruments, training syllabi, had failed. The principles improvised over Budapest would echo in simulator scenarios decades later: use what remains, communicate in whatever way you can, assign roles, trust feedback, never surrender to the first apparent impossibility. For the broader story of the B-17, the incident added one more layer to a reputation already thick with myth. The Flying Fortress had always been sold as a machine that could absorb punishment and keep going, its multiple spars and compartmentalized systems earning it a kind of mechanical heroism in newsreels and recruiting posters. Engineers knew that such resilience was the product of conservative design and a lot of weight. Crews knew that sometimes the propaganda was true. Mizpah, however, showed that the nickname Fortress was only half the story. No airframe, however rugged, flies itself without a nose. What kept that bomber in the air was not merely the way Boeing had routed its cables and braced its spars. It was the stubborn refusal of 8 men to let go of those cables until they had wrung from them every possible second of controlled flight. In the quiet after their return, some of them admitted to nightmares in which they again felt the steel biting into their palms, the sickening sense of the nose dropping when their grip faltered, the knowledge that below them lay not abstract enemy territory but individual fields and farmhouses they had glimpsed between blasts of flak. Yet most, when they spoke publicly, framed the memory more simply. Asked how they had done something manual said was impossible, they answered with variations on the same theme: the airplane was still flying, so they kept trying. That attitude, simple, stubborn, unglamorous, is what binds their story to the larger human cost of the air war over Europe. Tens of thousands of bomber crewmen never had the chance to improvise. Their aircraft broke up, burned, or vanished into clouds of flak. The survival of Mizpah did not cancel their losses. It added instead a different kind of weight, the knowledge that in a handful of cases, when circumstance and courage aligned, the line between certain death and improbable survival could be stretched by human hands, literally, through steel cables. Over Budapest that July morning, engineering said the noseless fortress should have fallen. The laws of physics set hard limits. Within those limits, for 10 long minutes, Ewald Swanson and his crew discovered that there was still a little room left, for innovation, for coordination, and for 8 men pulling bare cables against the sky.